pain and opioids. The process of pain signaling begins at the sensory neuron, in which the neuron picks up a signal that travels along the dendrites, axon, and into the synapse. The signal travels along the axon via action potential. This starts when the sodium goes into the cell and suddenly changes the charge in the inside of the cell from negative to positive. This is called depolarization. Then potassium leaves the cell. The potassium that leaves the cell can now be used in the sodium-potassium pump to pump sodium ions back into the cell, as well as pump potassium ions back in. This is a process called repolarization, and it sets the cell back up to receive another action potential. Once the signal reaches the synapse, calcium moves into the cell through the calcium channel. The calcium then signals the glutamate to fuse with the cell membrane. Glutamate then enters the synaptic cleft and binds to the receptors AMPA and NMDA. The binding of the glutamate to the receptor signals AMPA to open up and allow sodium through and into the cell. The NMDA allows calcium into the cell. The sudden change in charge with the ions allows the signal to continue on to the next cell. The signal then travels to the sensory cortex of the brain, where it is then perceived as pain. Opioids are drugs that act upon the body by suppressing pain. In our body, we have natural opioids, also known as endogenous opioids, referred to as endorphins, dynorphins, and enkephalins. There's also synthetic opioids, which tend to be much stronger than our natural opioids. Examples of these are oxycodone, hydrocodone, and methadone. Opioids work upon the body by suppressing pain. An opioid binds to an opioid receptor on a cell, which then causes the closing of a calcium channel. Without the calcium to signal the glutamate to fuse with the cell, the signal cannot carry on to a second neuron, and therefore the signal is stopped. Opioids also work upon the cell by causing euphoria. GABA is a neurotransmitter responsible for inhibiting the amount of dopamine. When a signal reaches the CA channel, calcium moves into the cell, which then signals the GABA vesicle to move and fuse with the end of the cell. The neurotransmitter GABA then moves into the synaptic cleft and binds with the GABA receptor. Once binded with the GABA receptor, the cell is signaled to inhibit the amount of dopamine released in the dopaminergic neurons. When an opioid binds to an opioid receptor, the CA channel is once again inhibited. With the CA channel inhibited, GABA does not move into the synaptic cleft and signal the GABA receptor to inhibit dopamine, leaving the dopamine amounts in the brain unchecked. GABA can also be used to regulate respiratory pattern in neurons in the brain's medulla. When GABA binds to a GABA receptor on a respiratory neuron, the cell is signaled to have a regular respiratory rhythm, thus allowing us to breathe. When an opioid binds to an opioid receptor on the synapse of a neuron, the calcium channel is then shut down. With no calcium getting into the cell, GABA cannot be released, and therefore we have an irregular respiratory rhythm. This can lead to shortness of breath or even cause you to pass out because of the inability to breathe. This is what we call an overdose. So, in conclusion, opioids suppress pain, increase dopamine in the brain, and overuse of synthetics can lead to irregular breathing pattern and faulty breathing, which can then lead to an overdose. Overuse can also detoxify, wear out, or create a lack of receptors. The lack of receptors leads to our common withdrawal symptoms, which consist of nausea, sickness, and fatigue, and more.